They said the first screams were mistaken for wind, a low, dragging cry that curled along the chimneys of the Whitlock estate. By morning, no one doubted it was human. The year was 1834, and the town of Blackwood carried itself in silence, yet all knew something unnatural stirred inside the Whitlock home. Whispers spread not in taverns, not in prayer halls, but in hushed corridors where no one dared raise their eyes. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The Whitlock family had ruled the edge of Blackwood since the late 1700s. Their estate stood above the marsh, a three-storied structure of pale stone and narrow windows, its roofline bent and darkened with mildew. It was not grandeur but weight that held the estate together. The villagers said the Whitlocks were less a family and more a body diseased yet persistent, swollen with secrets, each generation binding the next in silence. The household records, few that remain, suggest 23 servants lived within those walls at one time. Most were young women from the village, often taken in by promise of work and wages, but no one kept such positions for long. Contracts dissolved, names struck through, wages withheld. They left pale, thin and trembling when they left at all. Margaret Hale was different. Brought into service at 15, she remained until she was nearly 30. Her employment book lists her simply as kitchen maid. Though rumors persisted, she handled much more, tending to the youngest Whitlock child, correcting the missteps of the nursemaids, even dictating portions to the family physician when illness struck. She was, in short, indispensable, and that was precisely what made her dangerous. The Whitlocks, for all their refinement, carried a cruelty so practiced it seemed bred into them. Family correspondence, what has been preserved in fragments, reveals their disdain for Margaret, though they relied upon her daily. One brother called her a vessel too dull to hold anything but instruction. Another wrote, "She moves about as though she owns the air of the kitchen, yet she forgets she is but a shadow to us." It was said Margaret endured in silence, her eyes lowered, her hands folded against her apron. But silence has its own depth, its own record of memory. On the evening of February 6, 1834, neighbors reported strange sounds coming from the estate, not shrieks but a heavy pounding, as though furniture were being dragged across stone floors. At dawn, the chimneys bled black smoke that clung low over the marsh. The Whitlocks did not emerge. By the third day, a villager brave enough to approach the back steps claimed he smelled roasted meat, not foul, not spoiled, but seasoned, as though a feast had begun within a house where no guest was invited. The Whitlock daughter, Annalise, aged 12, had not been seen since. What remains of this first account comes not from court records, for no court ever touched the Whitlock scandal, but from fragments collected by a parish scholar named Elias Morton. His notes, brittle with water stains, speak of Margaret with an unsettling clarity. He describes her as a vessel carrying two hungers, one for survival, the other for retribution. Morton wrote of Annalise's absence with a surgeon's detachment. The child was not taken, she was served. The phrasing was deliberate, though no body was recovered. In the weeks that followed, Blackwood's villagers swore they saw shadows in the Whitlock windows, a woman's outline motionless beside the parlor glass. The form was too slight to be any of the Whitlock matriarchs. The posture was wrong, the head tilted as though listening for voices that had long gone quiet. Those who passed by said the figure appeared after dusk, and always in the same place. Some swore they heard faint humming, a lullaby, though none could recall its tune once they reached their home. One farmer's son described it as a song that seemed to come from the walls themselves, pulling breath in and out of the stone. The estate itself decayed quickly. By 1835 the roof sagged, windows broken, shutters sagging from their hinges. But the kitchen hearth, villagers said, never went cold. On fog-heavy nights the air smelled of broth, seasoned meat and charred wood, curling from the broken shutters like a memory refusing burial. They called it the house that would not starve. The Whitlocks, once a family of prominence, were gone, vanished, their documents cut short, their lineage abruptly ending in silence. The only name that remained on the parish roll was Margaret Hale. Her mark, not a signature but an X, stood beside the date of March. After that she too disappeared, and yet the house breathed still. Villagers whispered that Margaret had not fled. She had changed form. Some said she was within the walls themselves, her hunger feeding the timbers, her grief soaked into the mortar. Others claimed she walked the estate at night, apron still tied, carrying a tray that no longer bore food but bones. The truth was less visible but no less persistent. The Whitlocks had been consumed, whether by Margaret's hand or by the house itself. None could see. What is certain is this: Annalise was never seen again, and her absence became the silence that defined Blackwood for generations. On storm-tossed evenings when the wind combs the marsh reeds and rattles the estate's broken panes, the villagers still say her name. Not Annalise, not the Whitlocks. Margaret's. They say it softly, as though the syllables themselves might summon her, apron-bound, humming her lullaby, feeding the house that will never know hunger again. The Whitlock records. What little survived fire and damp conceal more than they reveal. But beneath the brittle pages of their ledgers, one detail clings with the weight of inevitability. Annalise Whitlock was the only child, the only heir. Her existence was not one of love but of necessity. She was bred to continue the Whitlock name, to secure alliances, to bind wealth to blood, to the family. She was not a daughter, she was an investment. Margaret Hale, the maid who had raised her from infancy, knew this truth better than anyone. Subscribe for more dark history that was never meant to be told. Annalise's early years were marked by fever and frailty. Physicians summoned from neighboring counties noted her weak lungs, her tremors, her near-constant cough. They prescribed cordials of laudanum and mercury tinctures, remedies that weakened more than they healed. It was Margaret who sat by her bedside at night, sponging her forehead, whispering lullabies through the worst of it. Annalise grew to depend not on her family, but on the maid whose hands carried both warmth and silence. Yet affection is not armor. When Annalise turned 10, the family's interest in her shifted from survival to utility. Visitors arrived at the estate, men with ledgers, women with gloves stitched too tightly at the wrist. They measured Annalise's posture, commented on her pallor, and whispered of contracts years in the making. Margaret was instructed to fatten her, to make her fit for purpose. The Whitlocks had no patience for frailty. Their cruelty sharpened as Annalise grew. Reports say she was locked in the cellar for speaking out of turn, denied meals for failing to sit straight at the table. A girl of 12, reduced to a vessel of obedience. And Margaret, still in her apron, still moving soundlessly between kitchen and nursery, bore witness to it all. Historians, those brave enough to treat this story as fact, argue that Margaret's revenge did not emerge in sudden violence. It grew as a root grows beneath soil, slow and unseen, drawing strength from neglect, cruelty, and silence. The transformation began, some say, in the kitchen itself. The Whitlock larders were famously stocked: pheasant, venison, imported wines, sugar cones wrapped in linen, coffee stored in tins that gleamed even in candlelight. But in Margaret's keeping, the ingredients became more than sustenance. They became her language, her weapon. She learned to craft meals that carried subtle influence, broths that lulled the family into heavy, dream-thick sleep, sweetmeats that left them dizzy and slow to rise, a roast seasoned just so, leaving a bitterness at the back of the throat that went unspoken but undeniable. Margaret's meals, once invisible as a servant's duty, became the rhythm of the household. The Whitlocks could not imagine life without her dishes, her bread, her stews. Dependence is a chain, invisible yet unbreakable. By February of 1834, the chain was complete. The disappearance of Annalise was no accident, nor sudden whim. It was the culmination of years, a slow simmer brought to a final boil. One account, preserved in Elias Morton's journals, speaks of the night itself. Morton recorded testimony from a former stable hand, a boy of 16 who swore he heard singing from the kitchen long after midnight. Not the high, delicate tune of Annalise, but the steady, low hum of Margaret's voice. The words, he claimed, were nonsense, old folk sounds, half hymn, half lullaby, but woven into the song was something else: the metallic clink of knives. The boy swore he left the estate the following morning, refusing wages, unwilling to return for his belongings. His description is chilling. The house smelled of feast, yet no one was seen, and the girl, the child, was gone. The Whitlocks never spoke of Annalise again, not to their neighbors, not in their letters. They carried on as though she had never existed. But Margaret knew. Margaret and the prevailing story, whispered from lips too afraid to claim certainty, is that Margaret prepared one last supper. The Whitlocks ate heartily, for the courses were lavish: stewed meats, spiced pies, dark gravies rich with marrow. They feasted while the storm lashed at the shutters, raising their glasses to themselves, never once asking why Margaret did not join them. It was not until the plates were cleared that the truth began to settle, heavy as lead in their stomachs. By then, it was too late. The Whitlocks had consumed their own legacy, their own daughter. What followed cannot be confirmed, for no witnesses survived within the estate walls, but neighbors swore that the chimneys belched smoke into the night, thick and black, carrying with it a scent both sweet and revolting. Those who passed the marsh at dawn claimed they saw a woman's figure in the kitchen window, apron still tied, hands resting on the sill, watching, waiting. The Whitlocks would not leave the estate again. In the years that followed the Whitlock estate's sudden silence, the town learned to speak of it only in mutters. The manor that once gleamed with wealth and prestige had withered into a hollow shell, its shutters sagging and its gates rusting beneath ivy. The gravel drive was no longer trodden by servants or carriages, but by weeds and shadows. To the villagers, it became less a house and more a wound, an ugly scar that refused to fade. But absence does not erase memory. Even stripped of life, the estate breathed with echo. Passers-by swore they heard the faint clink of cutlery drifting on the night wind, as though invisible diners still sat beneath the chandeliers. On damp evenings, the air carried a scent more haunting than rot, a warm, savory aroma of roasted flesh spiced with cloves and thyme. It was not foul but unsettlingly pleasant, the kind of smell that tempted a man to hunger before he realized what hunger he was answering. Neighbors stopped opening their windows after dusk. There is an account, recorded in 1835, of Father Keane, a parish priest who entered the estate at the town's request. They begged him to bless the grounds, to purge whatever Margaret had left behind. He carried only a lantern and a psalter, yet his journal speaks of what he found inside. The house is not empty, its walls breathe. I heard the girl, Annalise, laughing. The sound came from the dining hall, though I knew she was gone. The table was laid in perfection, plates shining, goblets filled, knives waiting, yet the chairs were empty, and I felt watched, not by one, but by many. He fled before finishing the blessing. Weeks later he was discovered wandering the churchyard, muttering of a feast that eats itself. By 1836 the Whitlock estate had become a dare for the reckless. Drunken boys crept up the drive, swearing they would touch the door. Most returned pale and speechless. One, Elias Finch, later confessed what he had seen. The door stood open just a crack. Inside there was light, though no candles burned. At the head of the table stood the maid, Margaret, or what remained of her. She was not flesh nor shadow, but something in between. Her apron moved, though there was no wind, and her hollow eyes fixed on us. She raised her hand, as if offering us a seat. We ran before the door opened wider. Margaret had not left, or perhaps she had become something more than human. Stories grew in twisted forms. Some claimed she lingered to guard the child she had loved. Others said she punished the Whitlocks still, forcing them to sit eternally at her table, each mouthful tasting of their own bloodline. But the darkest belief was that Margaret had never stopped cooking, that she was feeding the house itself. The Whitlock Manor became known as the house that eats. Travelers on the marsh road reported hearing voices inviting them in, promising warmth, drink and meat. Those who resisted lived to tell of it. Those who entered were never seen again. Most chilling of all was the song. Time and again, villagers described a woman's melody spilling from the blackened windows when the fog rolled in thick. A lullaby, soft and steady, without words, yet no one who heard it felt peace. Instead, it froze the marrow, as though the tune was not meant for the living at all. Parents warned their children never to hum it back. To echo Margaret's song was to invite her claim. By 1840, the Whitlocks' relatives had erased the manor from their claims, refusing to acknowledge its existence. The building stood abandoned, yet pulsed with a presence that would not die. Even stripped of family, stripped of servants, stripped of name, the house seemed alive. And always beneath the whispers and the legends, one refrain endured: Margaret is still cooking.
The Whitlock estate was more than a ruin. It was a mouth that would not close. Every decade that passed seemed to sharpen its hunger. By the 1850s, the villagers no longer dared to cross its gate, but that did not silence the stories. Children spoke of a figure in the window, a woman in a maid's uniform, posture straight, her head tilted as though listening to a whisper no one else could hear. Sometimes she raised a hand, as if beckoning, as if promising a seat at her endless table. Other times she stood motionless, a shadow carved against the glass, while the faint aroma of roasting meat curled into the night air. It was not just her image that haunted the town. The estate had a way of breathing into their lives. Bakers swore their bread carried the taste of smoke if their ovens were lit after midnight. Mothers claimed their milk soured in hours if they walked too close to the Whitlock Road. Hunters whispered that the deer of the marsh avoided the manor's shadow, as though even animals recognized the curse. And then there were the voices. Travelers, Strangers who knew nothing of the Whitlocks returned pale and trembling, saying the house had called their names. A woman's tone, soft, coaxing, threaded into the wind. Sometimes it sounded like their mother, sometimes their lover. Always it was close enough to recognize and trust until they realized the truth. The voice was not behind them, but within the walls of the house itself. The local physician, Dr. Elias Wren, left a letter in 1854 that still survives. I walked the eastern path to avoid the swamp. The house came into view as the fog rose, and though no living soul was near, I heard my daughter calling me. She has been buried 3 years. Still, I swear it was her voice, warm, pleading. Alive. I would have stepped through the gate had I not seen the figure in the upstairs window. The maid was watching. Her eyes caught mine across the distance. Not malice, not welcome, but ownership, as if she knew I was already hers. Dr. Wren never walked that road again. The townsfolk began to speak less of Margaret as a woman, and more of Margaret as an inheritance. She was no longer just the maid who avenged herself against the Whitlocks. She had become the house's pulse, its appetite, its steward. It was said she did not rest because her work was unfinished. But what work? Some claimed she cooked for the dead, feeding the family their sins for eternity. A banquet they could never escape. Others whispered that she fed the house itself, that the Whitlock Manor was alive, and its survival required flesh. Margaret was merely the hand that stirred the pot. By 1860, children in the village dared one another to place their ear to the gatepost at night. Those who did returned shaken, describing sounds they could not explain. The scrape of knives against porcelain, the shuffle of unseen footsteps, the faint clink of silverware. A few swore they heard a child's voice begging for release. But the most terrifying accounts were not of sounds nor sights, but of sensation. Several villagers, including hardened men who prided themselves on bravery, admitted that the moment they approached the estate steps, they felt heat, a suffocating, oven-like warmth, as though the house itself exhaled upon them. That breath carried whispers, and in those whispers they heard their own names. No one dared linger. The Whitlock estate became a paradox. A house no one entered, yet a house that touched everyone in the village. It remained abandoned, unclaimed, unwanted, yet utterly alive. And with each passing year, the line between myth and memory blurred further, until the question no longer was whether Margaret haunted the manor. The question became, who else was she waiting to feed? By the late 19th century, the Whitlock estate was not merely abandoned, it was forbidden. Roads bent away from it, as though cartwheels and hooves instinctively avoided the soil that fed on memory. The villagers never said its name aloud after dusk. Children were warned not to even point at its roofline for fear that the house itself would notice them. And yet the stories grew. In 1872, a traveling preacher named Silas Crow came to the village. He was a man of fire and brimstone, unafraid of superstition, and disgusted by what he called heathen whisperings. When the villagers told him of Margaret and her endless feast, he laughed. "A house cannot eat," he declared in the square, "and a servant girl does not command eternity. You've all been bewitched by guilt and gossip. I will step inside your haunted manor and prove it hollow." He was true to his word. At dusk, with the fog coiling low, Crow marched through the gates, his Bible clutched to his chest. He never returned. The next morning, villagers found the gate open, swinging gently as though breathed upon. On the path lay Crow's Bible, its pages drenched with something dark, thick and oily. Not quite blood, not quite tar. No body was ever recovered. But from that night on, a new detail haunted the legends. Passers-by swore they saw a second silhouette in the upstairs window. Beside the maid stood a man, tall, rigid, head bowed as though in prayer, forever trapped in supplication. Margaret had not lost her appetite. She had gained a guest. It was around this time that researchers began to take interest. The rise of spirit photography and a growing fascination with seances drew curious outsiders to the village. They came with cameras, notebooks, and bravado. Few stayed long. One diary, recovered in London decades later, described the experience of a young folklorist named Adelaide Kerr. She visited in 1889 with the aim of documenting the spectral servant of Whitlock House. Her notes, scrawled in an increasingly frantic hand. Survive as a chilling account. The air was sweet with roasting meat, though no kitchen fire burned. My companions insisted. It was the scent of a nearby farm, but there was none within miles. At the gate I heard music, a lullaby, carried not by air, but through the soil. My bones hummed with it. When I lifted my eyes to the window, she was there, a maid's shape, precise and deliberate. Her gaze pinned to me, but it was not her presence that undid me. It was the table behind her. It was set, plates gleamed, knives waited, and though no hand moved them, I heard the scrape of cutlery on porcelain, steady, endless, as though a meal was already being eaten. Adelaide returned to her lodgings trembling. By morning she was gone. Her belongings remained neatly folded, her journal left open on the desk. Witnesses swore they heard footsteps pacing outside her window that night, heavier than hers, accompanied by the faint rattle of a serving tray. The house did not only consume those who entered, it reached out. By the turn of the century, the estate was known across the region as the house that eats. Newspapers printed lurid accounts, half mocking, half fearful. The village economy even leaned on the legend. Peddlers sold charms to ward off Margaret's gaze, and innkeepers doubled their rates for those daring enough to approach the manor. But the villagers themselves did not laugh. They knew better, because the house remembered. When storms rolled through and lightning struck the marsh, the windows of Whitlock Manor glowed as if lit from within, though no fire was ever seen. And in those moments, if one stood at the edge of the property, a sound carried on the wind, the clinking of silverware, the low hum of a woman's song, and the faint hiss of a stew that had never stopped cooking. The Whitlocks were gone, the estate was rot, but Margaret remained, patient, tireless, forever setting the table. And each passing year, it seemed, there was always a new guest. By 1911, Whitlock Manor was less a ruin than a wound in the land. Ivy choked its chimneys. The roof sagged like a rotting ribcage. Yet the structure refused to collapse. It stood as if held upright not by beams, but by will. Locals swore the ground surrounding it was different, richer, darker, moist with a strange nourishment that never dried. Even in summer droughts, crops planted too close grew twisted and bitter, their roots tasting of iron. Still there were always those drawn to the place. The most infamous of them was Dr. Elias Fenn, a physician from Manchester, who styled himself a man of science, fascinated by reports of psychosomatic hysteria in rural communities. He traveled to the village in hopes of debunking the tale of Margaret. Fenn insisted that every haunting was but the projection of guilt, fear or rumor, a fever of the mind given form. He arrived with instruments, glass slides and a phonograph, intent on recording evidence that the legends were nothing more than delusion. For 3 nights, he camped on the edge of the Whitlock property. He noted strange occurrences with a detached calm, a persistent smell of roasted meat, though no fires burned, the sound of cutlery in the dark, the sight of pale hands fluttering past the windows like moth. He dismissed these as sensory illusions, but by the 4th night, his notes shifted. The lullaby is no longer outside me, it hums in my bones. The melody comes with warmth, not chill, as though the house exhales against my skin. I cannot rid myself of the aroma of broth. My stomach clenches as though I've missed some long-promised meal. Tonight I saw her, not as shadow but as flesh. Her eyes met mine. They were not cruel. They were tired, infinitely, terribly tired. She beckoned. My feet moved without command. I will step inside tomorrow. The journal ended there. Dr. Fenn's phonograph was later found on the manor steps. The recording began with his voice, calm and assured. It ended with silence, then a sound that investigators could never explain, the scrape of a ladle across a pot, followed by the wet, deliberate sound of chewing. After Fenn's disappearance, the villagers tried to bar the manor entirely. They nailed the gates, raised wards and set charms in the hedges, but none of it lasted. Nails rusted overnight, rope frayed as though gnawed, charms blackened, hollowed out, leaving only ash. The manor refused to be forgotten. And then came the war. In 1916, during the Great War, a unit of soldiers was quartered near the village. The estate was marked on military maps as an abandoned structure, suitable for supply storage. The villagers pleaded with the officers not to set foot inside. Their warnings were met with laughter. That night, the soldiers entered Whitlock Manor. They carried lanterns and rifles. Only one returned. His name was Corporal Hensley. The villagers found him stumbling through the square at dawn, barefoot, his uniform soaked as though with broth. He carried no rifle. Nope. His eyes were wide, rimmed with red, and he spoke only a single sentence before collapsing. We sat at her table. Hensley never recovered. He refused food, even when starved. He claimed he had already eaten more than any man could bear, and that his body was no longer his own. Within weeks he was dead. His skin stretched taut as though something inside him had fed until it ruptured him from within. The villagers buried him without ceremony. From then on, no maps bore the manor's name. Cartographers simply left a blank space where it stood, as if the land itself had been erased. But the house remained, patient, eternal. Margaret's presence lingered at the window, her silhouette waiting, her lullaby winding through the branches like smoke. She had been denied peace in life. In death she had found her feast, and the table was always set for more. By the 1930s, Whitlock Manor had become a ghost story passed in hushed tones, a tale older villagers wielded as warning against arrogance and cruelty. Children were told never to wander near the estate, not for fear of the living, but for the hunger that still seeped through its walls. Yet stories like rot spread farther than their origin. Travelers passing through carried whispers to neighboring counties, and from there to the city. The name Whitlock became a kind of shorthand for tragedy and taboo, a family remembered only for the taste of their own undoing. But the house, stubborn as marrow, remained untouched. It was during this decade that a new fascination emerged. Spiritualists, mediums, seances, table-rapping charlatans, all promised connection with the dead. The manor, with its reputation, became irresistible to such seekers. In 1934, a group of spiritualists from London traveled to the village, determined to prove Margaret's spirit still roamed. They brought cameras, phonographs, and crystal pendulums. They laughed at the villagers' pale warnings, insisting that fear was the greatest barrier to truth. The dead, they proclaimed, wished to be known. They entered the house at dusk. For 3 nights, their lanterns glowed through broken shutters. The villagers heard their chants, their songs, their demands to summon the maid. On the 4th night, the lanterns went out. The group never emerged. Days later, their belongings appeared scattered at the manor gates. A camera, cracked. A phonograph. The wax cylinder melted as if boiled. Pendulums knotted into loops of hair. On the phonograph's salvageable fragment, the recording was faint but undeniable. "We are not alone. She is here. Oh God, the smell." Then a woman's voice humming, soft, measured. A lullaby, the same melody that had haunted the village for decades. But beneath it, faintly, another sound. The scrape of chairs pulling closer to a table. Afterward, no spiritualist dared attempt another seance at the manor. It was said Margaret did not wish to be summoned. She did not need to be. She was already there, always present, always watching. By mid-century, the legend grew darker still. War returned, and with it rationing, scarcity, gnawing hunger. Villagers whispered that Margaret's story resonated now more than ever. Families spoke of the maid not as victim, nor ghost, but as something more primal, a patron of hunger. Its mothers muttered prayers over boiling pots, asking her to spare their children from the emptiness of war. Farmers whispered her name when soil turned barren. The manor became not merely a haunted house, but a shrine of dread. Some swore that leaving a bowl of broth or a plate of bread on the edge of the Whitlock property would ensure a family's survival through winter. Others believed the opposite, that such offerings only fed the hunger of the house, keeping it awake, alert, craving more. It no longer mattered what the truth was. Margaret had transcended fact. She had become myth, yet myths have teeth. In 1952, 2 boys dared each other to cross the threshold of Whitlock Manor. They were brothers, sons of a local butcher. The villagers watched them enter at dusk, their laughter carrying through the square. By dawn, only one returned. His hair turned white before its time. He would never speak of what had happened, but sometimes late at night, neighbors claimed to hear him muttering through his window, "We ate until we couldn't breathe," and she kept smiling. The legend no longer belonged to the Holloways alone. It belonged to the land, the village, and every trembling voice that repeated Margaret's name. The maid who had once served in silence had become eternal. The house that should have crumbled into ruin stood unyielding, its walls humming with a song no one dared to answer. And still, in the parlor window, her shadow lingered, head tilted, apron neat as though waiting to serve another meal.
By the 1970s, Whitlock Manor had shifted from whispered warning to dark allure. What had once been a place to avoid became a magnet for outsiders, young men and women with cameras slung around their necks,
journalists chasing folklore, and students eager for the thrill of defiance. The cultural shift was clear. The world no longer believed in curses, only in stories. And stories to them were fuel. Urban explorers arrived in droves. They carved their names into the cracked wood of the gates, snapped photographs of the sagging roofline, and dared each other to climb the rotting staircase inside. For many, the visit ended with laughter and boasts. For a few, the story took root in darker ways. One group of college students, 6 in total, brought recording equipment in the summer of 1974. Their plan was to spend the entire night inside, documenting every creak, every shadow. They joked in the pub beforehand about catching the ghost Maid on film. Their voices too loud, too careless. Only 5 returned. The survivor claimed they had made camp in the dining hall. They played cards, told stories, and when midnight came, they heard it. The faint clatter of dishes in the kitchen. At first they laughed until the sound grew louder, deliberate, steady, as if someone were setting a table just beyond the cracked doorway. The survivors swore they smelled roasted meat, rich and heavy, though their packs contained only bread and beer. The others grew quiet, their jokes dissolving into unease, and then a song, low, feminine, a lullaby winding through the dust-choked air, not from the phonograph they had brought, but from the dark itself. The group panicked. Some wanted to leave immediately, others pressed deeper toward the sound. The survivor followed the latter, and it was then that the laughter began, not from their friends but from somewhere ahead. The glow of lantern light revealed the dining table, set perfectly, polished silverware glinting in the dark. The survivor ran. He did not know if the others stayed, sat, or were seated by something unseen. He only knew he heard the scrape of chairs behind him as he bolted from the manor, and the unmistakable sound of chewing, slow, satisfied, unhurried. No trace of the others was ever found. The story made local papers for a time, but as always, official accounts explained the vanishings away, accidents, disappearances, youthful foolishness. Yet the legend only grew. The house had not been tamed by mockery or skepticism. It remained patient, and when outsiders came, it fell. By the late 70s, the manor was branded a haunted attraction. Tour companies quietly offered drives past it, promising tourists a glimpse of the infamous window where Margaret's shadow was said to wait. Some locals protested, but the economy won. Curiosity could be monetized, and so it was. But the manor never cooperated with spectacle. Cameras brought near its walls often jammed, film reels burned with static, voices warped when recorded. Tourists might leave with nothing but disappointment, but occasionally, very occasionally, they caught something more. A blurred figure in the corner of a frame, a child's laughter stitched beneath the wind, the faintest echo of cutlery clinking long after they had driven away. By then, Margaret was no longer a maid to those who spoke her story. She had become a symbol, a haunting contradiction, servant and master, victim and executioner, ghost and god. Some saw her as avenger of the oppressed, others as a warning of gluttony, denial, and cruelty left unchecked. But one truth remained constant: the house still breathed. The hunger had not ended, and every generation that mocked it seemed destined to learn the same lesson that Whitlock Manor did not forgive, and Margaret did not forget. On storm-heavy nights, tourists still reported seeing her in the window. Her silhouette was unchanged, apron crisp, head tilted, listening, waiting. By the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, America's appetite for the supernatural had shifted from folklore to entertainment. Cable television was blooming, and so were the programs that promised proof of ghosts, hauntings, and unexplained mysteries. Whitlock Manor, with its grisly reputation, was irresistible. Producers approached the town council with offers, glossy contracts, generous payouts, promises of national exposure. Many locals resisted. They still crossed the street when passing the manor. They still lowered their voices when Margaret's name was spoken. To them this was not contempt, it was caution. But money, as it had decades before, won. The first crew arrived in 19. They were armed with cameras, microphones, and bravado. Their host, a man with a sharp suit and sharper smile, strutted before the crumbling gates, announcing to viewers that tonight the truth will be revealed. It was, but not in the way he imagined. Inside, the crew moved methodically, narrating the manor's history, staging reenactments of Margaret's fateful revenge. They carried trays of fake food, laughed about the cannibal feast, and smirked at the thought of a servant outsmarting her master. Then at precisely midnight, the sound engineer froze. In his headphones, layered beneath the hum of static, was the unmistakable chime of silverware. He ripped the headset off, pale and trembling, but when asked, he refused to repeat what he heard. Minutes later, cameras began to malfunction. Lenses fogged from the inside, batteries drained despite being fully charged. Lights flickered, casting long distorted shadows along the mildewed walls. And then the smell, not mold, not rot, but roasted meat, rich, savory, mouth-watering. It rolled through the halls as though an unseen feast had been prepared. The host, still eager to mock, leaned into the act, calling into the air, "What's for dinner, Margaret?" The answer was not words but a sound. The scrape of a chair pulled back across stone. Every microphone caught it. Every crew member heard it. The footage ended abruptly. What little remained, spliced into the final cut, aired weeks later. Viewers at home saw shaky glimpses of the dining room, the table impossibly reset with plates, goblets and tarnished silver. They heard the lullaby faint and warbling, and the unsteady breathing of the cameraman. The episode was pulled after a single broadcast. Officially, the network cited technical issues. Unofficially, rumors spread that 2 crew members never returned. Their contracts quietly settled, their names never again mentioned on air. Yet the manor did not recede from the spotlight. If anything, the failed broadcast drew more. Other teams arrived, self-styled paranormal investigators, amateurs with camcorders, skeptics, eager to disprove what they called the servants' hoax. Most left with nothing more than dust and silence. A few left shaken, whispering of unseen hands brushing their arms, of lullabies threading through their sleep long after they had left. One woman, a producer in 1997, was institutionalized after filming inside. She claimed Margaret followed her home, filling her dreams with the smell of cooking meat, with the sound of cutlery clinking endlessly in the dark. The house did not simply repel curiosity, it devoured it. By the end of the decade, Whitlock Manor was no longer just a local legend. It was national, it was international. Magazines, documentaries, and late-night hosts all invoked it, each trying to turn the story into spectacle. But those who entered always carried something back. A silence, a shadow, a song that did not belong to them. And in the town itself, where generations had already learned what outsiders refused to believe, the warnings remained the same. Do not step onto the porch. Do not listen too long. And if you smell food, leave before you're invited to the table. For Margaret was not a character. She was not content. She was not a story to be framed between advertisements and applause. She was still waiting. By the dawn of the new century, Whitlock Manor was no longer just a house. It had become a monument, not of stone, not of architecture, but of memory. The structure itself sagged, weather-beaten and cracked, yet it endured as though the land itself refused to let it collapse. Tourists arrived in cautious waves. Some came to gawk, others to dare. They left trinkets at the gate, coins, scraps of paper scrawled with apologies, flowers that withered overnight. No matter how many were left, the ground swallowed them, and the iron bars of the gate always seemed rusted with something fresher than rain. The town carried on as it always had, trying and failing to ignore it. Children were still warned never to go near, and travelers were still told to keep their distance. The story of Margaret was whispered with the reverence of scripture, not as a ghost tale, not as entertainment, but as truth. The servant who turned her suffering into judgment, the woman who fed the Whitlocks their own cruelty until they choked on it. And still, every generation reported the same sign. At dusk, the figure of a maid could be seen in the upstairs window, her posture straight, her head tilted as though listening for a voice that never came. At night, the lullaby drifted through the fog, carried on the wind in a language no one remembered, but everyone recognized. And always, the smell, that terrible, alluring smell of roasted meat, drifting from a kitchen that had not seen flame for over a century. Some swore the house shifted with the years, that its walls leaned closer, its windows sank deeper into shadow, its halls stretched in ways that defied measurement. One historian claimed the manor was no longer bound by brick and timber, but by the hunger that had been birthed within it, the hunger of injustice, the hunger of Margaret herself. The legend hardened into something colder than fear. It became inheritance. Children of the town grew up knowing her story as fact. They were not told fairy tales of witches in the woods, or monsters in the dark. They were told of Margaret, and how cruelty always finds its way back to the source. Even now in the present day, Whitlock Manor stands. The windows are boarded, the doors chained, but no barrier ever holds for long. The boards splinter, the chains corrode. It is as though the house refuses silence, demanding that each generation bear witness. Visitors who claim to be brave still test its boundaries. Some step onto the porch, only to stagger back, choking on air that burns like hot breath. Others linger too long by the walls, and later find bruises blooming on their arms, shaped like the grip of a hand. And there are those who never leave at all. The records are scattered, the stories conflicting, but the pattern remains. A drifter gone missing, a student dare gone too far, a pair of thrill seekers whose abandoned car was found idling by the gates, all vanish without trace, their absence absorbed into the legacy of the house. And when the wind shifts just right, the clinking of silverware rings louder than before, as though another place has been set at the table. Margaret remains, not as a spectre chained by rage, nor as a soul begging release. She is something else, a keeper, a memory, a reckoning. The world beyond the town may still debate her story, treating it as myth, performance, or superstition. But within the shadows of Whitlock Manor, there is no debate. The truth is not hidden in books or archives. It breathes in the walls, it hums in the air, it lingers in every heartbeat of those who dare to listen. And so the tale does not end. It cannot, because Margaret will never allow it to. On stormy nights, when the lightning splits the sky and the thunder rattles the windows, the townsfolk still cross themselves, still quicken their steps. They whisper the same warning their grandparents did, the same their grandchildren will repeat. If you hear the lullaby, turn away. If you smell the feast, do not linger. And if you see her at the window, never, ever meet her eyes. For Margaret, the maid who served revenge, does not rest. She waits, always, and Whitlock Manor waits with her.